Every 3 seconds, somewhere in the world, a person receives an Alzheimer's diagnosis. By the time you finish watching this video, more than 20 people will have heard those words. And the hardest part isn't that number. The hardest part is that in most cases, the earliest symptoms had been showing up between 5 and 10 years before anyone recognized them for what they were. Today we're going to cover 7 early warning signs of Alzheimer's that most health channels never mention. Not because they're hidden, but because they're subtle, easy to misread, and some have only recently come to light. Because catching them early, here in 2025, can mean the difference between a treatment that works and arriving too late. We are living through an unprecedented moment in the history of Alzheimer's research. For the first time in decades, we have medications that can actually alter the progression of the disease. But there is one essential condition. They must be given very early. Lecanemab and donanemab, the first drugs that modify Alzheimer's. In November 2024, the European Commission approved lecanemab, the first drug in Europe to modify the course of Alzheimer's by acting directly on its underlying biology, reducing beta-amyloid deposits in the brain. Then in July 2025, the EMA approved donanemab, making it the second drug of this kind available in Europe. Both are only effective in the very earliest stages. Early diagnosis is no longer just about having information. It's about having access to treatment. By analyzing electronic health records over a 10-year window before diagnosis, researchers identified more than 70 conditions that appeared more frequently in people who later developed Alzheimer's. These were dominated by mental health problems, sleep disorders, cardiovascular conditions, and metabolic issues, such as type 2 diabetes. By analyzing electronic health records over a 10-year window before diagnosis, researchers identified more than 70 conditions that appeared more frequently in people who later develop Alzheimer's. These were dominated by mental health problems, sleep disorders, cardiovascular conditions, and metabolic issues, such as type 2 diabetes. Do you know what may be the very first sign of Alzheimer's to appear in the body? It's not memory loss. It's not confusion. It's the loss of the sense of smell. And most people put it down to a cold, old age, or years of smoking, never suspecting what might actually be happening in the brain. In 2025, a discovery changed everything. A Nature Communications study concluded that microglia destroys olfactory neurons. Research from the German Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases, DZNE, and Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, published in Nature Communications, identified the underlying immune mechanism. Microglia cells, the brain's own defense system, mistakenly destroy the nerve fibers responsible for detecting smells. Led by Dr. Lars Pager and Professor Johan Herms, the study combined animal models, human brain tissue, and PET imaging. The mechanism explained phosphatidylserine, a lipid that normally stays on the inner layer of the neuronal membrane, shifts to the outer surface in neurons affected by Alzheimer's. This acts as an eat-me signal for microglia. In the olfactory bulb, microglia begin destroying neural connections they should be protecting. The result is a gradual loss of smell that develops before any cognitive symptom appears. Not every smell loss is Alzheimer's. Loss of smell can also result from rhinitis, sinusitis, long COVID, smoking, certain medications, or simply normal aging. What should raise concern is a slow, progressive loss with no clear respiratory cause, especially when it occurs alongside other signs from this list. Here's a simple self-check. Every morning, smell something with a strong, familiar scent: coffee, soap, a spice like cinnamon or garlic. If over several weeks you notice the smell seems weaker, or you sometimes can't identify it at all, mention it to your doctor, not as an alarm, but as useful information. This one is especially important for anyone who lives with someone who snores heavily or occasionally stops breathing during the night, because that sleep disorder, which so many of us brush off, is now being studied as one of the most significant risk factors for developing Alzheimer's. Sleep apnea and amyloid in the brain. Sleep apnea increases the risk of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's by 85%. Adriano Targa, a researcher at CYBER, the Biomedical Research Networking Center, points out that obstructive sleep apnea raises the risk of developing mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's by 85%. The relationship runs in both directions. Apnea increases Alzheimer's risk, and Alzheimer's increases the prevalence of apnea. We have long known that Alzheimer's disrupts sleep, but we can now confirm that sleep disorders like apnea also increase the risk of developing this neurodegenerative disease. Sleep problems have shifted from being a symptom to being a risk factor in their own right. Mayo Clinic, apnea and tau protein in the brain. A Mayo Clinic study found that people with sleep apnea show greater accumulation of toxic tau protein in the entorhinal cortex, the brain region responsible for storing and retrieving information related to visual perception and memory. This area is particularly vulnerable to tau buildup and is precisely where Alzheimer's begins its damage. What about insomnia and hypersomnia? The Vanderbilt Health Study, 2026, also identified insomnia and hypersomnia, sleeping too much, as conditions that appear more frequently in the 10 years before an Alzheimer's diagnosis. Poor sleep in any form, too much, too little, or constantly interrupted, is a signal that deserves attention. What to do if you or someone close to you snores heavily? Loud snoring with pauses in breathing should be assessed by a doctor. CPAP treatment for sleep apnea is effective and widely available. According to Dr. Osorio, treating apnea in the early phase may slow Alzheimer's progression when tissue damage still precedes clinical symptoms. The third sign is the one most often overlooked because we find another explanation for it. We tell ourselves, he's sad because he retired. She's been like this since her partner passed away. He just doesn't get excited about anything anymore. And perhaps that's all it is. But sometimes it's something else entirely, because a study published in March 2026 reshaped our understanding of the signals that precede Alzheimer's. Vanderbilt Health published in 2026 on depression and neuropsychiatric symptoms, 10 years before diagnosis. A Vanderbilt Health study, published in Alzheimer's Research and Therapy in March 2026, tracked electronic health records over a 10-year period before Alzheimer's diagnosis. Among the more than 70 conditions identified, mental health problems, depression, paranoia, psychosis, topped the list of conditions most frequently present in people who later developed the disease. Specifically, depression was associated with a subsequent Alzheimer's diagnosis, with an odds ratio of 1.80, 95% CI, 1.29 to 2.50. The association was strongest in the later stages of life and closer to the point of diagnosis. The crucial distinction: ordinary depression or a warning sign. Not all depression signals Alzheimer's. What should raise concern is depression or apathy that appears for the first time after the age of 60, with no clear emotional trigger, that doesn't respond well to standard treatment, or that comes alongside other signs such as smell loss or memory problems. Dr. Heather Whitson of Duke University notes that personality changes or severe depression can indicate that something is shifting in the brain. The danger of the wrong diagnosis. A researcher at the University of Utah described a real case. A patient admitted with severe memory disturbances and harmful thoughts about herself was discharged with a dementia diagnosis. When she received a specialist evaluation, it turned out she was severely depressed, nothing more. With depression treatment, she did well. This case illustrates why differential diagnosis is so essential. The key is knowing when to seek help. If someone you know well, or you yourself, is experiencing a new sadness or apathy lasting more than 2 weeks, with no clear cause, combined with loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities, that warrants a medical evaluation. Not to panic, but to rule out treatable causes and, if necessary, begin appropriate monitoring. We've all had that moment. You're mid-sentence and a word just slips away. It's right there, on the tip of your tongue, but it won't come. That's completely normal. The problem begins when it happens constantly, when sentences trail off unfinished, when you start using vague stand-ins like that thing or what's it called because the right word simply won't arrive. Why it happens: the hippocampus is affected first. Short-term memory loss is a common early symptom of Alzheimer's because the hippocampus, the brain's short-term memory center, is affected early in the disease process. Word-finding difficulties are directly linked to this early hippocampal deterioration. The role of stress and fatigue. Chronic stress, sleep deprivation, anxiety, and certain medications can produce exactly the same word-finding problems. Before worrying, consider these factors. What distinguishes a genuine warning sign is how it progresses over time, and whether it appears alongside other signs from this list. This is one of the most practical and concrete signs, and also one of the first to affect daily life in tangible ways. I'm not talking about major financial mistakes. I mean small things. Struggling to count out the right change at the market, finding it hard to follow a utility bill, forgetting whether something has already been paid, or suddenly losing track of a tax return that was always handled independently, without a second thought. Why it appears before memory loss. According to the Pasquale-Maragall Foundation, Alzheimer's produces problems with spatial orientation and an inability to calculate distances and reason about quantities. These abilities depend on brain areas affected in the early phases of the disease. Managing everyday finances requires planning, sustained attention, and working memory, functions that deteriorate early. Difficulty with tasks that were previously handled with ease. Managing personal finances or completing basic household routines is an early Alzheimer's sign. It stems from changes in reasoning ability and the capacity to concentrate and organize information. What to watch for in a family member. If you notice that someone who always managed their finances competently is beginning to struggle with straightforward bills, responding to scam calls, or missing important payments, offer support without removing their independence. And if it continues or gets worse, go with them to their doctor. This is often the sign that finally prompts families to act, because up to that point, the forgetfulness could be explained away. But the day your father gets lost walking to the market he's been going to for years, or your mother arrives home very late because she couldn't remember the way back, that can no longer be dismissed. In Alzheimer's, problems with spatial orientation appear alongside an inability to judge distances, recognize familiar surroundings, or locate objects. These symptoms can affect driving, showing up as new scratches on the car, minor collisions, or failure to observe stop signs and traffic lights. When driving becomes dangerous, spatial disorientation in early Alzheimer's tends to show up in driving before other areas because driving calls on multiple cognitive functions at once: navigation, divided attention, distance judgment, rapid decision-making, and spatial memory. If someone drives regularly and begins showing these signs, assessing their driving ability becomes a safety priority. The difference from normal aging. With age, spatial processing can slow down. What distinguishes the Alzheimer's warning sign is disorientation in extremely familiar places: the neighborhood, the usual route to the doctor, the regular trip to the supermarket, combined with progression over time. The final sign is, for many families, the most painful of all, because you're not watching someone who can't remember things. You're watching someone who no longer seems like themselves. The warm, affectionate person they once were now reacts with disproportionate irritation. The calm, steady presence now has episodes of suspicion or paranoia, and the family doesn't know whether to feel hurt or frightened. Neuropsychiatric symptoms precede diagnosis. Queen Mary University studied depression, anxiety, and irritability as peri-diagnosis manifestations in 2025. A systematic review from Queen Mary University of London, published in Alzheimer's and Dementia in January 2025, analyzed prospective longitudinal studies to identify pre-diagnosis manifestations of Alzheimer's. Alongside depression, it found evidence that personality changes, irritability, anxiety, and psychotic symptoms appear before classic cognitive decline sets in. Over time, these symptoms expand to include disinhibition, loss of interest, speech difficulties, impaired orientation and judgment, depression, social withdrawal, aggression, anger, changes in sleep patterns, suspicion, and delusions. What most surprises families? Many families report that personality changes came before obvious memory lapses. The person became suspicious, accused trusted family members of stealing, grew irritated over trivial things, or showed complete indifference towards activities they had once loved. Sadness, apathy, anxiety, and agitation are symptoms of the loss of emotional and behavioral brain functions that affect personality in the early stages of the disease. It is not their fault, or yours. It is essential to understand that these personality changes are not choices the person is making. They are a direct consequence of changes in the brain. The irritability, the suspicion, the apathy, these are not bad manners. They are symptoms. Recognizing them as such completely transforms the family dynamic and the response that is called for. We've looked at 7 signs: loss of smell, sleep disorders, new depression or apathy, word-finding difficulties, problems with money, spatial disorientation, and personality changes. None of them, on their own, means you have Alzheimer's. But if you notice several together, if they're getting worse over time, if they're worrying you, that's the moment to speak with a doctor. Not to frighten yourself, to get informed. And here's the most important thing I've shared with you today. In 2025, for the first time in history, we have drugs approved in Europe that can modify the course of Alzheimer's. Lecanemab and donanemab don't cure the disease, but they slow it down when given early enough. That means detecting the early signs is no longer just about knowledge. It's about access to a treatment that simply didn't exist before. If this video has been useful to you, share it. Send it to someone in your family, a relative, a friend, anyone you know who might need this information. And if you want to find out which specific daily habits offer the most protection for the brain after 60, that's exactly what the next episode covers. See you soon.